Hi, it's Liam from Levity Books, and today we're talking about Cyberpunk 2077. I like to read books while I play video games because it helps me get more immersed in the game environment and to take the character's story seriously, and it helps me to really study the world and get immersed in it. You will appreciate a game far more when you can imagine yourself inside the game world, and reading builds that cognitive ability. As a neuroscientist, avid gamer, and reader, I think I'm in a unique position to recommend the best books that you might want to read during your first playthrough of Cyberpunk, or maybe after if you're really interested in this field of science fiction. In this video, I'll give you a more detailed overview of the literary origins of Cyberpunk than anywhere else, and I'll give you the 3 best books that you can read during or after your first playthrough if you really enjoy the game world. You might get some unique views here, as I find a lot of guides online have been written by people who don't read game or study neuroscience as much as I do. In my final year of a master's degree in neuroscience, a friend and I looked up the electronic schematics for something called a galvanic vestibular stimulator, and we went to this very quiet public space called a hack space in London and built it out of a lunchbox, some electronics, some skin electrodes, wired them up with some resistors in parallel. And we had this device which could show people how balance works in the brain. Basically, with 2 electrodes behind the ear, you can manipulate someone's sense of balance in real time. And this, in essence, is the core of Cyberpunk. Cyberpunk is talking about how the brain works with electricity, and therefore, could we use technology to augment our mind and our human potential? And our device was great, it worked. It made me realize that the brain does work on electricity and that Cyberpunk is really talking about something that can actually happen in the real world. So the 3 Cyberpunk books that I would recommend are Mirror Shades by Bruce Sterling, Neuromancer by William Gibson, and A Scanner Darkly by Philip K. Dick. Mirror Shades defined cyberpunk, Neuromancer defined cyberspace, and A Scanner Darkly showcase the harm of technology and drugs for the mind. In this video, I'm going to help you decide which book is right for you. I would not recommend reading Neil Stephenson or Richard K. Morgan instead, as although they're quite popular these days, they're less original, intellectual, or highly acclaimed, so you're going to get less out of reading them. So we're all on the same page, let's define cyberpunk. I like to say that cyberpunk took sex, drugs, and rock and roll, turned it into hex, drugs, and mind control. Another phrase for cyberpunk is high-tech lowlife, symbolizing the advance of technology and the degradation of humanity. The best definition for cyberpunk, hands down, is in the introduction to Mirror Shades, as this is where cyberpunk was defined. Mirror Shades is a great introductory survey to cyberpunk. There are 12 stories and about 260 pages. So you get a good range of styles there, although I would say that not all the styles in the stories are cyberpunk. There's a lot of punk stories in there, a lot of kind of 80s rock, which you don't see always in cyberpunk. Mirror Shades was published in 1988, although Philip K. Dick died 6 years before this, and I see him as the father of cyberpunk, and most of his writings were from 1950 to 1982. So cyberpunk did really begin before the 80s, although it really found its place in society in the 80s. Simply put, cyberpunk is a dystopian science fiction subgenre that deals with a power struggle for technology between individuals for their freedom and for societies for their control. Timothy Leary called the computer the LSD of the 1980s, and cyberpunk really explores that statement by seeing how technology like electronics can be used to expand human potential at the level of the mind. In Mirror Shades, Bruce Sterling categorizes cyberpunk literature as a clash of 4 literary genres: the magical realism of new wave science fiction, the objective focus of hard tradition science fiction, the existential epiphanies of visionaries, and finally, the paranoia about technology and societal control. On screen, I'm showing the best examples of these genres which you might consider for wider reading. I, however, think cyberpunk has moved beyond this original definition in Mirror Shades. To me, cyberpunk is an exploration of the societal role for technology explored through a film noir plot with an anarchist agenda in the context of transgressive male violence. From what I've seen, all cyberpunk narratives contain the potential threat of violent hostility by men against an authoritarian society in an attempt to renegotiate power over technology for freedom and control. The social, moral, and sexual decay in cyberpunk worlds is a forewarning against the potential abuse of power through technology. I believe these three novels are a better, wider context for a cyberpunk genre. I'd be really interested in hearing what your definition of cyberpunk is in the comments below. Okay, so number 2, Neuromancer, the book which predicted the internet. William Gibson is the most active and acclaimed living cyberpunk author. I saw him at a book launch earlier this year in Montreal of Drawn and Quarterly. I took some notes. The audience asked whether he thought that we were headed for this bleak cyberpunk future that we see in media. But he was optimistic. He says cyberpunk hasn't got to the 22nd century because no one's afraid anymore of the future. We have this wise trust that history will lead us through, despite all the things that have happened in the past. Now, William Gibson is particularly hard to read, so if you don't read much or you've never read science fiction, I would not recommend you go near William Gibson. But nobody in cyberpunk can write better world environments than William Gibson. He is really good at building a massive environment and building loads of devices and inventions. He's one of the few authors in cyberpunk that I really believe the technology works. So if you're interested in the creativity of how machines can interact with humans, or just the vastness and the expansiveness of this cyberpunk universe, William Gibson is definitely the author you should read. And finally, my favorite science fiction author, Philip K. Dick, who I think is underrated in all cyberpunk lists, as his work is the backbone of cyberpunk, and has been featured in so many films and TV shows that you've probably heard of before. Most people recommend Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep because it's the book that inspired Blade Runner, and of his work it deals most heavily with cyborgs. But I don't think that's the point of cyberpunk. I think his later work has far more interesting and deep thoughts about what technology and drugs do for the mind. His later books are wiser and more mature. A Scanner Darkly, in my opinion, is a far better choice as it's his last strong science fiction novel, and there's also a film which features Keanu Reeves as the main character, so it's a good sign that we're talking about the same cyberpunk world. A Scanner Darkly has cyberpunk technology and drugs, but it's not really about that. It's really about the potential damage these things can have on society. A Scanner Darkly, unsurprisingly, is dark. Unlike other cyberpunk works, A Scanner Darkly has a very realistic world environment. It's not as futuristic as the other books, and that's what makes it really cool because you can relate to it a little bit more, and it's just a very unique look at the whole cyberpunk genre. Philip K. Dick is definitely who you should be reading if you're interested in that dark, violent, hostile, psycho-thriller edge to the cyberpunk which puts it apart from all other science fiction. So in summary, if you're playing Cyberpunk 2077 and you want to really compare it to its historical and socio-political roots, if you want to know what it's trying to say about society, then Mirror Shades is the book you should be reading. If, however, you're more interested in the human-computer interfaces and how technology can be so diverse and complex in the cyberpunk world, you should definitely be reading William Gibson. Finally, if you're interested in this dark, hostile, emotional angle that cyberpunk has above all other science fiction, then you should definitely be reading Philip K. Dick. With these 3 books, you'll recognize what cyberpunk is about, what it looks like, and what it feels like. Thanks for watching. If you like these recommendations, please leave a like to help more people find this content, and have fun gaming.